Captain Jarek sat in the dimly lit control room of the Eclipse, his fingers hovering over the worn console. The human warship, a relic from the early days of the galaxy's exploration, was nothing more than a shadow of what it once was. Its engine sputtered, and its metal hull was covered in patches, a grim reminder of its age. Yet despite its frailty, the Eclipse was still functional, barely. Outside, the void of space stretched endlessly. Beyond the distant stars, alien fleets moved, their ships sleek and powerful. They were the military giants of the galaxy, ships that could obliterate entire worlds without a second thought. To these alien empires, the Eclipse was a joke, nothing more than a rusted husk in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. But Captain Jarek wasn't one to accept defeat easily. The Eclipse had been his responsibility for years, and he refused to let it die quietly. The crew, a ragtag group of misfits and soldiers, relied on him. They believed in him, even when everyone else had written them off as insignificant. "We're running out of time, Captain," said Lieutenant Carson, breaking Jarek's thoughts. She stood at the far side of the control room, eyes glued to the ship's radar. Jarek turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The radar screen blinked red, an alert flashing across it. Carson pointed at the screen. "They're here. The Zorath fleet. Looks like they've been tracking us for days." The Zorath were one of the most feared alien races in the galaxy. They were ruthless and efficient, known for their brutal tactics in war. Their ships were fast and heavily armed, and they showed no mercy. They had no reason to care about a weak human vessel like the Eclipse. But that didn't matter. The Zorath had orders, and those orders were to destroy. Jarek's mind raced as he considered his options. The Eclipse couldn't outrun them. Its engines were failing, and its weapons were almost useless. His crew, all a part of this losing battle, needed him to act. "Prepare the crew. We don't back down. We fight," Jarek commanded, his voice steady but filled with determination. The crew scrambled, going to their stations. The Eclipse wasn't just a ship, it was their home, their last stand against the galaxy's overwhelming power. Jarek took a deep breath, glancing once more at the radar. The Zorath ships were drawing closer. He couldn't afford to waste time. "Captain, we're not going to last long," said Carson, urgency in her voice. "We need a plan. Something drastic." Jarek's fingers brushed against the controls again, his mind searching for a solution. Then, an idea struck him. The Eclipse had an old experimental weapon system buried deep in its hull, something the Zorath didn't know about. It had been forgotten by most of the crew, gathering dust over the years. Maybe it was a long shot, but it was all they had left. He turned to Carson. "We're activating the old weapon. Get to the engine room and prepare the ship for the energy surge." Carson blinked in disbelief. "Are you sure? That thing hasn't been tested in years." "We don't have a choice," Jarek replied. "Either we fight or we die here." With a nod, Carson rushed off to the engine room, and Jarek turned back to the controls. The Zorath fleet was closing in. This was it, the final chance for the Eclipse to prove that even the weakest ship could become the galaxy's strongest nightmare. The battle was about to begin. Captain Jarek stood at the bridge of the Eclipse, his eyes locked onto the approaching Zorath fleet. His heart raced as he saw their ships, sleek, sharp, and menacing, closing in. Every instinct told him that they were outmatched, outgunned, and out of time. Yet he refused to surrender. There had to be a way to survive. There had to be a way to make them see that humanity wasn't just another helpless target in the galaxy. "Captain, the weapon systems are online," Lieutenant Carson called out from the console. "But we're not sure it'll work. It's a prototype, and we haven't tested it in years." Jarek nodded, his hands gripping the cold metal of the chair. "We don't have a choice," he said. "Activate it. Now." The experimental weapon had been designed long ago, a last-ditch effort by human scientists to create a weapon capable of taking down enemy fleets. But for years, it had remained dormant, ignored and forgotten as human technology lagged behind the galactic powers. Now, it was their only hope. The Zorath would never expect it. They would never know what hit them. Carson didn't hesitate. She pressed the button, and a low hum filled the bridge as the Eclipse's systems powered up in ways they hadn't before. The ship seemed to tremble, as if awakening from a deep slumber. Jarek felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to focus. This was their moment. "Energy levels are rising," Carson reported, "but it's unstable. We need to aim carefully, or we could destroy the ship instead." "Just aim," Jarek said, his voice steady. "I'll take care of the rest." The Zorath ships were almost upon them now, their weapons charging, ready to fire. They saw the Eclipse as no threat, just an outdated, malfunctioning ship. They would be wrong. Jarek took a deep breath, his hands flying over the controls. The Eclipse shook violently as it locked onto its target. With a quick push of a button, the weapon fired. A blinding flash of light erupted from the Eclipse's bow, and a shockwave rippled through space, knocking out several nearby Zorath ships. For a moment, there was silence, as if the galaxy itself had frozen in time. Then, the Eclipse roared to life. The Zorath ships, once so sure of their victory, were scattered. Their shields failed as the weapon tore through their defenses, reducing their ships to twisted metal and debris. Jarek stared at the screen in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It had worked. The Eclipse, the weakest ship in the galaxy, had just become a nightmare for the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. But the victory came at a cost. The ship shuddered again, the energy reserves draining rapidly. Carson looked over at Jarek, panic in her eyes. "Captain, the weapon's taking too much power. We can't sustain this for long." Jarek didn't have time to worry about that. The Zorath were regrouping, and more ships were on their way. They had only moments before the Eclipse became the next target. "Get us out of here now," Jarek barked. Carson scrambled to reroute power to the engines. The ship's thrusters flared to life, and with a loud burst, the Eclipse shot forward, narrowly avoiding a retaliatory strike from the Zorath. Jarek let out a long breath. They had done it. For now, at least. But the Eclipse had awakened something in the galaxy. A new power, one that no one was ready for. The Eclipse tore through the blackness of space, its engines humming beneath the weight of an immense power it had never known. Captain Jarek stood at the helm, staring at the empty space ahead. The Zorath fleet was temporarily disabled, but they wouldn't stay down for long. The Eclipse was vulnerable. Its weapon had drained much of its power, and the ship was barely holding together. "How much longer until we reach the hidden outpost?" Jarek asked Lieutenant Carson, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. Carson's fingers flew over the controls. "We're almost there, Captain. But we're running on fumes. If we don't refuel soon, we won't make it anywhere." Jarek nodded, rubbing his temples. The ship's power systems were strained beyond capacity, and the weapon's activation had caused more damage than expected. But it had worked. The Zorath fleet had been broken, their advanced ships falling apart under the Eclipse's onslaught. The crew was in shock, unable to fully process the magnitude of what they had just unleashed. The Eclipse had become more than just a ship. It had become a weapon of unimaginable power. The once weak, outdated vessel was now capable of leveling entire fleets in the blink of an eye. But this newfound strength came with risks. They didn't know how to control it, and the weapon's energy continued to surge through the ship's systems, threatening to destroy it from the inside out. "We need a plan," Jarek said, turning to the crew. "We can't just keep running. If we don't figure out how to stabilize this power, we'll all be dead before the Zorath ever catch up to us." "Agreed," Carson said, her voice sharp. "But we can't do it alone. We need help. There's a secret research station on the edge of the sector. If anyone can fix this, it's them." Jarek's eyes narrowed. "The station is a long shot, but it's our only hope. Get us there, Lieutenant. Now." The Eclipse made its way to the station at full speed, but the journey felt like an eternity. The ship shuddered with each passing moment, as if it was alive and struggling to stay together. The crew could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on them. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they arrived. The station appeared as a small, unassuming structure floating in the depths of space, a beacon of human ingenuity in a galaxy of powerful alien empires. The Eclipse docked, its damaged systems barely holding it together. The crew quickly made their way to the research station's control room. It was a high-tech facility, but it felt different from the military command centers they were used to. There were no grand fleets here, no high-ranking officials, just a handful of scientists and engineers who had dedicated their lives to developing technology for humanity's survival. "We need your help," Jarek said, addressing the lead scientist, a woman named Dr. Elena Carter. "We've activated something dangerous. It's taken control of our ship, and we can't stop it." Dr. Carter eyed them carefully. "You've activated the experimental weapon, haven't you?" Jarek nodded. "It was our last resort. But now it's growing stronger, and we have no idea what it's capable of. We need to stabilize it before it consumes us." Dr. Carter's face softened, but the seriousness in her eyes didn't fade. "We'll do what we can. But understand this, the weapon you've unleashed is not like anything we've ever seen. It's not just a tool. It's alive, evolving. If you don't figure out how to control it, it will consume not just your ship, but possibly your entire crew." Jarek's stomach tightened. He had known there were risks, but hearing it out loud made the weight of the situation more real than ever. "We'll find a way," Jarek said, his voice firm. "We have no choice." And with that, they began the impossible task of understanding and controlling the weapon that had turned the Eclipse from the weakest human ship into a galaxy-shaking force. The quiet hum of the Eclipse's engines was the only sound in the control room as Captain Jarek watched the data streaming across the screens. The ship had been docked at the secret research station for several days now. Dr. Elena Carter and her team of scientists were working tirelessly to understand the weapon that had transformed the Eclipse into a terrifying force. But despite their best efforts, the weapon was still evolving, growing more unpredictable by the hour. Jarek's eyes were tired, his mind constantly racing. The crew was on edge, unsure of what to expect next. Every vibration of the ship, every shift in the power systems, made them wonder if the weapon was about to take control again. "Captain," Carson said from across the room, her voice urgent, "you need to see this." Jarek walked over to the radar station, his heart sinking as he saw the incoming transmission. The screen displayed a map of the galaxy, showing several powerful alien fleets converging on their position. "They're here," Jarek muttered, his voice tight. "The Zorath and others are coming for us." The Zorath fleet had been shattered, but their defeat had only drawn more attention to the Eclipse. Now, the ship had become the focus of every major power in the galaxy. The weapon that had destroyed the Zorath was unlike anything they had seen before, and they all wanted it. Some sought to control it, others wanted to destroy it. Either way, the Eclipse was in danger. "We need to move," Carson said. "If we don't leave now, we'll be caught in the middle of a war we can't survive." Jarek nodded. "Prepare the ship for takeoff. We're leaving." The Eclipse disengaged from the station and made a hasty jump to another sector. But the galaxy was not a place where you could hide for long. The alien fleets were quick to respond, and they began to hunt the Eclipse relentlessly. As the Eclipse traveled through the stars, Jarek couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His ship, once dismissed as a forgotten relic, had become the most valuable and dangerous target in the galaxy, and no one was going to let it slip away without a fight. News of the Eclipse's power spread like wildfire. The word was out, and every faction, both friendly and hostile, was now interested in what humanity had created. Whispers of the Eclipse became legends in the galactic underworld. Some called it a monster, others called it a savior, but no one dared to ignore it. Jarek stood on the bridge, staring out into the void. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Soon, they would have to face the full force of the galaxy's most powerful empires, and he wasn't sure if the Eclipse could survive another battle of this magnitude. "We need to prepare," Jarek said quietly. "The galaxy is coming for us, and we need to be ready to fight back." Carson looked at him, her face grim. "How do we fight a galaxy?" Jarek turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "We do what humans do best. We fight with everything we have. We adapt, we innovate, and we survive." The Eclipse was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's resilience. And as long as Jarek and his crew drew breath, they would fight to keep it that way. The Eclipse soared through the void of space, its engines running at full power. The ship had become a symbol, a beacon of hope to some, a nightmare to others. Captain Jarek sat in his chair, staring at the view of distant stars. It had been days since the Eclipse had left the secret research station, and the Zorath fleets, along with other galactic powers, were closing in. The ship was still in one piece, but for how much longer? "We can't keep running forever," Lieutenant Carson said, breaking the silence. She stood at the radar station, her eyes scanning the incoming data. "They're getting closer. All these ships. They'll be here soon." Jarek turned in his seat to face her. "We'll fight them off," he said, though his voice carried a note of doubt. "We have to." Carson didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, her face a mixture of worry and determination. The crew of the Eclipse had always been a small group, but now they were part of something far bigger than they could have imagined. They had become the last line of defense for humanity in a galaxy that saw them as weak and insignificant. Yet now, humanity's strength was embodied in the Eclipse. But Jarek knew they couldn't fight a war against the entire galaxy. The Zorath were powerful, and they weren't alone. The Eclipse's weapon was a force to be reckoned with, but it was also unstable. It was a gamble. And every battle they fought with it put the ship and the crew at greater risk. There were days when Jarek questioned if it was all worth it, if the gamble was too dangerous to continue. "How many more battles can we survive?" Jarek murmured under his breath. Carson, sensing his uncertainty, turned toward him. "We can survive as many as we need to," she said firmly. "This ship is more than just a weapon, Captain. It's more than just a tool. It's us. It's our will to fight. That's why we've come this far." Jarek didn't respond. He knew she was right. The Eclipse wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of what humanity could achieve when pushed to the edge. But that didn't make the next battle any less terrifying. As the days passed, the crew's uncertainty turned into a kind of quiet resolve. They were a small team, but they had something the galaxy's most powerful fleets didn't: human ingenuity. While the alien empires relied on overwhelming force, humanity relied on adaptability, creativity, and grit. They had no other choice. In the crew's downtime, Jarek walked through the corridors, watching as his crew worked together, sharing ideas, preparing for the unknown. They had never asked for this fight, but now that it was here, they weren't backing down. Every member of the Eclipse knew the risks, but they also knew they had a purpose. The galaxy might see them as weak, but they would prove that even the smallest ship could change the course of history. One of the younger crew members, Ensign Kale, approached Jarek as he passed. "Captain, I just wanted to say, we're with you. We all are." Jarek stopped, meeting Cal's gaze. The young ensign had only recently joined the crew, but his words felt like a reassurance. "I know," Jarek replied quietly. "And I'm with you all too." The crew's morale was lifting. They had come together in a way that no one had expected. They were no longer just a ship and its crew. They were humanity's last stand. And as the Eclipse flew deeper into unknown space, they knew one thing for sure: they weren't going down without a fight. The Eclipse drifted through the galaxy, its crew constantly on edge. The ship was in better condition than it had been before, but the constant tension weighed on them. Every member of the crew knew that it wasn't just the Zorath that were hunting them now. Word had spread across the galaxy about the eclipse, about its incredible weapon, and the power it wielded. And where there was power, there were enemies. "We have a problem," Lieutenant Carson said as she approached Captain Jarek on the bridge. Her voice was tight, a clear sign that something was wrong. "There are more ships coming. Not just the Zoreth, but others. They're all converging on our location." Jarek glanced at the screen, his heart sinking. The radar was filled with red dots. Alien ships, countless fleets, all coming from different corners of the galaxy. It was clear now. They were being hunted, not just by the Zoreth, but by anyone who wanted a piece of what the eclipse had become. "We won't be able to outrun them," Jarek said quietly. "They've got us cornered." Carson nodded. "We're going to have to fight, Captain. If we don't, we won't have a ship left to run from them." Jarek clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had no illusions about their chances. The eclipse might have turned into a powerful weapon, but it wasn't invincible. It was still just one ship, and the enemies they were facing were far stronger and more numerous. The crew gathered in the briefing room, all eyes on Jarek as he stood at the front. "We got a fight ahead of us," he began, his voice steady, though the gravity of the situation was clear. "The galaxy is hunting us. They want what we have, the power to control this weapon. And they will stop at nothing to get it. But we won't go down without a fight." "We're not ready for this, Captain," one of the crew members, Ensign Kale, spoke up. "We barely have enough supplies, and we're running low on fuel. We're outgunned and outnumbered. How do you expect us to survive?" Jarek paused, his eyes scanning the room. He knew the odds were stacked against them. "I expect us to survive because we have something they don't. We have humanity's greatest weapon, our will to adapt. We've survived this far because we didn't give up. We're not going to start now." The crew looked at each other, their doubts slowly fading. Jarek's words had a way of pulling them together, reminding them of what they had fought for and what they stood to lose. "Carson, what's the status on the weapon?" Jarek asked, turning to her. "The weapon's ready," Carson replied, though her voice was filled with uncertainty. "But it's unstable. We've pushed it to its limits. We can't use it too much, or we risk destroying ourselves." Jarek nodded. "We'll use it when we need to, but we have to be smart. We need to draw them in, make them think they have the advantage. Then, when they least expect it, we hit them hard." The crew began to work, each person taking their station, preparing the ship for battle. The Eclipse wasn't just a ship now. It was their last chance to defend humanity. It was their weapon, and they would use it to its fullest, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Outside, the vast enemy fleets were closing in. The Eclipse was outnumbered, but it wasn't alone. As the crew made their final preparations, they knew that no matter what happened, they would give everything to survive. And the galaxy would never forget the nightmare that was the Eclipse. The Eclipse floated in the void, its hull scarred from the last battle, its systems pushed to their limits. The crew had spent the past several days preparing for the inevitable clash with the alien fleets that had surrounded them. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that the coming battle could be their last. The stakes were higher than ever, and yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, the crew remained determined. Captain Jarek stood in front of the massive view screen, staring at the approaching enemy ships. Their numbers were overwhelming, and their firepower far exceeded that of the Eclipse. It was hard to imagine a way out. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running low on supplies. But one thing was certain: the Eclipse would not go down without a fight. "We can't keep using the weapon like this," Carson said, her voice tight as she looked at the damage reports coming in from the lower decks. "Each time we fire it, we risk destabilizing the ship even further. If we don't find a way to control it soon, we'll all be dead." Jarek turned to face her, his expression grim. "I know, but we don't have a choice. If we don't fight, if we don't show them that we're not weak, they'll destroy us. We can't let that happen." Carson nodded, her worry clear. She had seen the weapon's power firsthand. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered, and yet it was a double-edged sword. The energy required to fire it was immense, and with each shot, the ship became more unstable. They were playing with fire, and they didn't know how much longer they could keep it under control. As the enemy ships closed in, Jarek knew that time was running out. They had to act quickly, or they would be overwhelmed. He turned to his crew, his voice firm. "This is it. We're going to give everything we have to survive this. We'll use the weapon when we need to, but we'll fight smart. We'll outmaneuver them, use every advantage we have. Humanity has always survived by adapting. This time will be no different." The crew nodded, their faces set with determination. They had no illusions about what lay ahead. The odds were against them, but they would fight to the very end. The Eclipse powered up, its engines roaring to life. The weapon systems hummed with energy as they prepared for the first strike. Jarek gave the order, and with a burst of light, the weapon fired. The blast hit the nearest alien ship with devastating force, ripping through its shields and tearing apart its hull. But the Eclipse shuddered violently in return, its power systems struggling to keep up with the demand. The crew felt the strain as the ship groaned under the weight of the energy coursing through it. "Damage report." Jarek barked. "We've taken hits," Carson replied quickly, her eyes scanning the readouts. "Hull integrity is holding for now, but we can't take too many more hits like that." The Eclipse surged forward, narrowly avoiding a retaliatory blast from another alien ship. Jarek's heart pounded in his chest as the ship danced between the enemy fleets, using its agility to avoid the concentrated fire. But the weapon's power was growing more unpredictable with each use. Every shot caused the ship to tremble, and the energy readings were dangerously high. The crew was pushing the Eclipse beyond its limits, and Jarek could feel the weight of that decision pressing down on him. He had no choice but to keep fighting, but at what cost? The battle raged on, and despite the crew's best efforts, it was clear that they could not sustain this level of conflict for much longer. The weapon was draining the Eclipse of its energy, and the ship was beginning to show signs of critical failure. "We need to end this now," Jarek muttered to himself, knowing that they had one last chance. If they didn't act soon, the Eclipse would be a pile of debris, its crew scattered across the stars. With a final, desperate push, the Eclipse fired its weapon one last time. The resulting blast tore through the alien fleet, but it also sent a shockwave of destruction through the ship. The Eclipse shook violently, alarms blaring, and the control systems began to flicker. "Captain, the weapon. It's too much," Carson shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise of the ship's alarms. Jarek's hand gripped the armrest of his chair as he tried to hold the ship together. "We have to make it count," he said through gritted teeth. And then, with a final, earth-shattering blast, the Eclipse unleashed its full power. The alien fleets were decimated, but the cost was steep. The ship had given everything it had. The battle was over, but at what cost? The Eclipse was on the edge of collapse. Captain Jarek stood at the bridge, his eyes fixed on the view of the enemy fleet ahead. The damage to the ship was visible. Hull breaches, power surges, and malfunctioning systems all over. The crew had been pushed to their limits, but somehow they had survived. Now, facing the largest fleet they had encountered, Jarek knew this was their last stand. There was no more room for mistakes. "Captain, they're closing in fast," Carson said, her voice strained as she scanned the radar. "The Zoreth are leading the charge, but there are other fleets in pursuit. This is it. We can't outrun them." Jarek turned to her, a grim expression on his face. "I know, but we still have one chance. We fight back, and we make it count." The Eclipse was still armed with the unstable weapon, but the crew knew it was running on borrowed time. Every shot they fired brought the ship closer to total failure. But it was the only weapon they had. They had no other choice. The alarms began blaring as the enemy ships locked onto the Eclipse. The battle was about to begin. "All crew, prepare for combat," Jarek ordered, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. We fight for survival. We fight for humanity. The Eclipse surged forward, its engines roaring to life. The crew worked quickly, each person knowing their role in the impending battle. The ship's weapon powered up, its energy readings spiking dangerously. Every person aboard understood the risks. They could be making their final move. Activate the weapon, Jarek commanded. The Eclipse's massive energy cannon fired, sending a wave of destruction across the enemy fleet. The closest Zoreth ship was torn apart in an instant, its hull disintegrating under the blast. The other alien ships faltered, surprised by the sudden power of the Eclipse. But it was clear that the weapon's power came at a high cost. The Eclipse shuddered violently, groaning under the strain. Damage report, Jarek barked. Shield systems failing. Hull breaches across multiple decks. Carson called out, her voice tense as she worked the console. We can't take another hit like that, Captain. Jarek's mind raced. He knew they couldn't keep firing the weapon without destroying the ship, but the enemy was relentless. He glanced at the radar. More ships were arriving. They were surrounded. We need to end this, Jarek muttered to himself, then turned to Carson. Can we use the weapon one more time? Just one more shot. Carson hesitated, looking at the data. Captain, it's too risky. If we fire again, the ship might tear itself apart. We could lose everything. Jarek's eyes were fixed on the view of the enemy fleet, still advancing. We don't have a choice. Do it. Carson pressed a button, and the ship powered up again. The energy surged through the Eclipse, and the weapon fired once more, this time with a force greater than before. The blast hit a large portion of the alien fleet, causing massive explosions and sending debris scattering in every direction. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. The Eclipse's weapon had done its job, but the ship itself was now barely functional. Alarms blared louder than ever, and the Eclipse rocked from side to side. The crew held on, knowing they had done all they could. Captain, we're not going to make it, Carson said softly, looking at the damage reports. The ship is critical. We've done what we can, but it's over. Jarek stood in silence, his heart heavy. He had known this moment would come. The Eclipse had defied all odds, and they had fought with everything they had. But now, the ship was beyond saving. Prepare to abandon ship, Jarek said, his voice steady. We'll find a way to survive. We always do. As the crew began to prepare for the worst, the Eclipse remained standing tall in the midst of the chaos, a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. It had become more than just a ship. It had become a symbol of humanity's strength. And even if the Eclipse was lost, its legacy would live on. The Eclipse shuddered violently as it drifted through the wreckage of the final battle. Sparks flew from damaged consoles, and the sounds of alarms echoed through the ship's corridors. The enemy fleet had been decimated, but the cost had been unimaginable. The Eclipse was barely holding together, and the crew was running out of time. Captain Jarek stood at the bridge, staring at the wreckage of the alien ships scattered across the battlefield. The weapon, once a symbol of humanity's hope, had now drained the Eclipse of everything it had. The ship was crippled, its systems failing, and the crew was preparing for what seemed like the inevitable end. Captain, the enemy fleet is retreating, Carson reported, her voice filled with disbelief. We did it. We actually did it. Jarek's eyes were still fixed on the view of the stars, but his mind was racing. The Eclipse had won, but at what cost? Their ship was falling apart, and they had no idea what was left to save. He knew the crew couldn't stay here much longer. The situation was critical. We need to get out of here, Jarek said quietly. Prepare for emergency evacuation. Everyone should head to the escape pods. As the crew began to prepare for the worst, a strange signal suddenly blipped across the radar. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. Jarek's eyes narrowed as he studied the readout. Carson, what is that? He asked, his voice tense. Carson quickly scanned the data. I don't know, Captain. It's not like any signal we've seen before. It's coming from within the wreckage. Jarek felt a chill run down his spine. The Eclipse was a ship of mysteries, but this was different. Something about the signal felt unnatural. Track it, he ordered. Find out where it's coming from. The crew worked quickly, rerouting power to the scanners and attempting to pinpoint the source of the signal. It took a few moments, but finally the source was clear. It was coming from deep within the heart of the Eclipse, from a place they had never investigated. The area where the weapon had been powered. This can't be right, Carson said, her voice shaky. The weapon's core. It's sending the signal, but it was destroyed. Jarek's mind raced. The weapon had been the source of the Eclipse's power, but it had been nearly impossible to control. And now, it seemed like the very thing that had almost destroyed them could be their salvation, or their final undoing. Captain, Carson said, looking at him with wide eyes. The weapon, it's not just a weapon anymore. It's alive. It's evolving. Jarek stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. The weapon was supposed to be a one-time use, a last resort. But now, it seemed as if it had become something else entirely. We need to investigate, Jarek said, his voice firm. Take us to the core. Let's see what's happening. The crew made their way to the heart of the Eclipse, where the weapon had once been stored. The area was dark, cold, and eerily silent. But as they approached, a faint glow began to pulse from the center of the room. It was the weapon. But now, it wasn't just a machine. It was something else. The energy readings were off the charts, and the ship seemed to respond to it in ways they couldn't understand. As Jarek and Carson stepped closer, the pulse of energy grew stronger, and the room began to hum with power. Suddenly, a voice, calm, yet unmistakably real, filled the room. Human, the voice said, you have awakened me. I am the power you seek. The crew froze in shock. The weapon, now alive and aware, was speaking to them, and it was clear. Humanity had not just unlocked a power beyond their understanding. They had awoken something that was far more than a weapon. Jarek took a deep breath. What do you want from us? He asked, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. I am yours, the voice replied. But you must choose. Use me again, and I will give you power beyond your wildest dreams. But the price will be steep. Or leave me be, and I will fade into nothingness. The choice was clear. The weapon, now a sentient being, was offering them a chance to control it. But at what cost? Jarek's heart raced as he faced the decision that could change everything. But one thing was certain. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of humanity itself. Captain Jarek stood frozen, staring at the glowing core that once served as the weapon's heart. The room was still, except for the hum of power radiating from the core. His crew was gathered behind him, equally speechless. The voice, calm and deep, still echoed in their minds, filling the empty space with a strange sense of both power and fear. I am yours, the voice had said, but you must choose. Use me again, and I will give you power beyond your wildest dreams. But the price will be steep, or leave me be, and I will fade into nothingness. Jarek's mind raced. The decision was impossible. How could they control something that was so much more than a mere weapon? Could they really afford to risk it all again, knowing the consequences? He turned slowly to face his crew, his gaze landing on Lieutenant Carson. She met his eyes, her expression full of questions, uncertainty, and fear. She was the one who had stood by him through every decision, every danger, but even she wasn't sure how to respond to this. What do we do, Captain? Carson asked quietly, as if unsure whether she wanted to hear the answer. Jarek took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. The weight of leadership pressed down harder than ever before. The Eclipse had been through so much. The weapon had brought them to the brink of destruction, yet it had also given them victory. Now it had become something else entirely, a sentient force, offering them power. The temptation was there, power that could protect humanity, that could reshape the galaxy in their favor. But at what cost? We have to think this through, Jarek said finally. We can't let the weapon control us. We're not the same as the empires we fought. We fight with our minds, not our fists. Carson nodded slowly, clearly relieved that Jarek hadn't immediately given in to the temptation. You're right. We're not them. We can't use it just for power. It's too dangerous. Jarek stepped forward, staring at the glowing core. But if we leave it, we lose everything. We've fought so hard to get here, to survive. I don't know if we can walk away from this. The choice isn't simple. Suddenly, Ensign Kale spoke up from the back of the room, his voice filled with uncertainty. Captain, what if there's another way? What if the weapon could be used for good? What if it could help us defend humanity, without us losing ourselves in the process? The idea lingered in the air, and for a moment, everyone was silent, considering the possibility. Could they truly control this power without becoming consumed by it? Was there a way to make it work for them, without paying a terrible price? Jarek looked at the crew, each face filled with doubt and determination. He realized that this was no longer just a decision about the eclipse or the weapon. This was about the future of humanity. If they didn't act, they would lose everything they had fought for. He turned back to the weapon's core. We'll find a way to control it. We'll make it work for us, for humanity, and not let it destroy us. We're human. We adapt. We survive. For the first time in what felt like forever, the crew let out a collective breath. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made a decision. They would take control of their fate, not let power control them. As the crew moved to secure the weapon, they knew that their journey was far from over. The eclipse had become more than just a ship. It had become a symbol, a nightmare to their enemies, but a promise of hope for humanity. And now, they would carry that legacy forward, knowing that the future of the galaxy rested in their hands. The eclipse had proven that even the weakest ship could become the greatest force in the galaxy. Now, it was time for humanity to show the universe what they were capable of.